F1 Manager 2024. Where do I even begin with this game? And I mean that in so many ways. A career mode where I saw Kimi Antonelli immediately jump ship from Mercedes to Red Bull, which should have been impossible, but frankly that barely even registers on the radar weirdness in this game. A career mode where Enzo Fittipaldi crashed more times than his granddad won Grand Prix. Where I left my own team and then they did 1 year without any sponsors at all. Which is Honda 2007 and 2008 levels of arrogance, and it went the same way for them as it did for Honda. A career mode which becomes much more gender balanced with entirely female teams in both feeder championships, and more than just that, entirely female podiums as well. Even in F1 there ended up being multiple women racing as well as in prominent off-track roles up and down the paddock. Which if nothing else is a really nice, inclusive and progressive fantasy. And more plausible than Logan Sargent becoming a true F1 veteran. He had greater staying power than any other 2024 F1 driver, genuinely, as he was the only one to have been on the grid every single year from 2024 to 2036. Sargent was quick given the decent car and a on merit podium finisher. But obviously the most important point is that this game marks a premature end for the F1 Manager series as Frontier Developments have ended their licensing agreement with F1 a year early. That's a big topic and one I covered in an article I wrote for the race, and given so many aspects of the previous F1 Manager games, which I talked about in their own all seasons of career mode videos, never mind that this game has, or at least had, so many glitches including visual ones like when a random Mercedes affiliate regen driver was apparently driving 12 F1 cars simultaneously, or when race engineer Mark Slade described himself as a driver, or when the Saudi pit garages were in the void that one time, or when Max Verstappen crashed through a wall and over to the other side of the circuit in Baku. Or more impactful one-off glitches like when George Russell in an Alpine finished 9th in Bahrain, yet the game said he won, with a total race time of 1 second. And that wasn't just a visual glitch, the game awarded him the full 25 points, slightly corrupting the championship standings for that season. But those are actually insignificant to the various more substantial repeated glitches or just blatant inaccuracies to the real life sport. Many of these were addressed in subsequent updates, but I'm talking about the game as it was once I poured over 130 hours into it for this video, not what it ended up becoming several patches down the line. With all of that in mind, it's not really a surprise the F1 Manager series wasn't going to last long term. To be fair, there were some positive steps forward for this game, like mechanical failures. Drivers recovering much quicker from spins and lockups and not just sitting on the side of the track, hemorrhaging places like they used to. The all new Creator Team mode, which is clearly cut from the same cloth as the EA and Codemasters games, but allows for greater visual customization than those games do. And the newfound ability to simulate races, which is a great feature with how bloated the modern F1 calendar is, and extremely helpful for me when making this video. The reason I highlight the positives and why I do want to stress, I genuinely enjoyed playing this game. It is flawed, but I had fun. And I want to stress that because obviously with any business story, and more to the point, business failure, there's the human element with plenty of staff layoffs in the wake of F1 Manager 2023's disappointing sales. With that going on at Frontier, it's not really a surprise F1 Manager 2024 is very similar to the past games, for better and for worse, and I don't want any part of this video to seem callous about that situation. My all seasons of career mode videos are often partly career mode reviews. This video is no different, but since we know it's the end, it's also a look at where this series went wrong and just how badly Frontier missed the mark. So into the career mode, and I set the car development and race difficulty settings to hard. Worth keeping that in mind that what I experienced is this game at supposedly its most difficult. Especially because I started my team with the least amount of money in the bank, as well as the lowest quality facilities and car. The only tweaks from the default was replacing Dennis Hauger with Ollie Behrman, and replacing Matt Harmon with, technically, categorically, 2-star quality staff member James Key, purely because he was the best technical chief in the $2 million per year price bracket. So I didn't start with the worst possible setup, but certainly very close to, and I knew the first season was going to be a write-off. And so I went with the silly branding choice of having a tiger print car livery. In qualifying at Bahrain for my team's debut race, Doohan and Behrman beat Sargent. But in the race we were nowhere, dropping behind Sargent almost immediately. A late charge by Behrman ensured he beat Joe to finish 20th. whilst Doohan spun at the same corner twice, and he was the only driver to be lapped 3 times. A few upgrades helped our competitiveness, and our peak was 11th and 12th in Austria, and that sharp rate of improvement from being about 2 seconds a lap off to midfielders within half a season is quite telling about how easy this game is. Ultimately, it was Max Verstappen who was the Drivers' Champion in 2024, 137 points ahead of runner-up Norris, with Leclerc 3rd and Piastri 4th, which to be fair is bang on. Mercedes had a shocker as both Russell and Hamilton were outscored by Alonso. RB did well with both drivers on over 40 points, and Ricciardo narrowly the victor in that teammate battle. And Pierre Gasly scored his and Alpine's sole points of the season in Abu Dhabi, leaving Ocon, Sargent and both PSL Racing and Sauber drivers on 0. Red Bull won the Constructors' Championship with McLaren 2nd, Ferrari 3rd, and then it's a steep drop down of nearly 500 points to Aston Martin in 4th, and ahead of Mercedes. RB were in a group of their own with Haas, Williams and Alpine all on single digits, and my team beat Sauber to 10th, which is deeply impressive considering how far behind the curve we were at the start. In Formula 2, Isaac Hadjar was the champion there, leading a Campos 1-2 with Pepe Marti the runner-up, and Kimi Antonelli was the best non-Campos driver. Unsurprisingly, Campos won the team's championship, and with more than double the points of Prema in 2nd. Meanwhile in Formula 3, Tim Tramnitz and the team he drove for, MP Motorsport, won their respective titles in 2024. Now, just in case you thought I'd taken the edge off the game's difficulty by having some real life F1 personnel in and helping out with car development, well, firstly I don't think that makes a huge difference, as we'll soon see, but also James Key and Alessandro Cinelli were poached from my team, and whilst I tried to stop this, it was before I realised the 28-day negotiation deadline approach was broken. So they left me in the weeds and I had to get lower quality replacements instead. And because the payouts for contracts being bought out was also broken, I didn't receive a single penny. That's why it's on the issues list, even if it has since been fixed, because I had to deal with it. In the move from 2024 to 2025, there were 18 driver changes, including Alonso partnering Verstappen at Red Bull and Hamilton going to Ferrari. Only Verstappen, both McLaren drivers and Behrman stayed with the same team. As with my previous F1 Manager videos, if you want a full breakdown of driver, staff and engine supply changes for each team, including any changes in their overall rating, there's a link in the description to a Google Sheet detailing that. Also, because I assumed Doohan was on a multi-year deal when he wasn't, Aston Martin snapped him up. That meant I had to sign Enzo Fittipaldi, and on one hand his repeated crashes made him an absolute liability, given I was forced to emergency manufacture new same specification parts at hugely inflated costs because I couldn't break park firmware conditions as pit lane starts weren't in the game at the time. Despite all of that, to be fair to Fittipaldi, what should have been absolutely unnecessary expense, he was quick. Just a little too quick for his own good sometimes. In fact, my team's first ever points were scored by Fittipaldi with a 9th place result in a simulated Australian Grand Prix. And to be fair to the Brazilian, those weren't the only points he scored that year. Max Verstappen won the Drivers' Championship for the 2nd year in a row, 2nd year in a row in this game, 5th year in a row if we're including his real life ones as well. But he only beat his new teammate of Alonso by 12 points. Leclerc beat Hamilton in a Ferrari 3-4, and Mercedes were the clear 4th fastest team as Bottas and Albon outscored Magnussen and Doohan in the 2 Aston Martins. Fittipaldi scored 9 points for PSL Racing, whilst Behrman was the only driver other than both Saubers and Alpines not to score any. Red Bull had a much stronger season with Alonso in the 2nd seat, and with Ferrari now their closest challengers. Mercedes were closer to the front whilst Aston Martin was stuck on double figures, and my PSL Racing team moved 1 place up the table to 9th. In Formula 2 is the now Red Bull Academy and Trident race driver Kimi Antonelli, who won. Unsurprising considering his overall rating is already higher than multiple drivers racing in F1. Whilst Trident took the team's championship thanks to Antonelli and Zane Maloney. In F3, Mattia Zagazita won the Drivers' Championship whilst Trident did the Feeder Series double, as they were the team's champions in F3 as well. Season 3, 2026 is where things changed a lot, because of the first major car regulation change which, even with us having by far the weakest technical staff, was a major opportunity as we surged up the order. Ollie Behrman won a simulated Spanish Grand Prix to take PSL Racing's first Grand Prix win. With Fittipaldi in 5th and the last driver not to be lapped, it meant 4 of the top 5 cars were Honda powered. Piastri's now Ferrari powered McLaren being the exception there in 3rd, and ultimately it was Piastri who ended Verstappen's run of titles as the Aussie was crowned the 2026 Drivers' Champion. Verstappen only just beat Alonso with 2 points separating them, with Norris in 4th and 68 points behind his teammate. Behrman took 5th place in the standings, 100 ahead of Hamilton in the lead Ferrari, and a further 25 ahead of Fittipaldi in the second PSL racing car. The bottom half of the table is more revealing though, and not just because only 3 drivers from 3 different teams, specifically Ayumu Iwata at RB, Sargent at Alpine, and Joe at Haas, all failed to score points. The crucial detail we're missing here is the engines each team was using this year. Obviously, although I say that, I mean we'll ignore real life developments for a second, Alpine were using Renault engines, but so too were Haas, RB, Sauber, and Aston Martin. All of the 5 bottom teams in the Constructors' Championship. Now technically, Sauber in 7th had their best season in this career to date, scoring 54 points and only 10 less than Mercedes, whilst using Renault engines. But Sauber had Carlos Sainz, and it genuinely was just him that made the difference, as I never saw any evidence of the car itself being good. It had a Renault engine, and Gasly and the other Sauber only scored 1 point. Williams had their best season to date with 5th in the table with a still developing Teo Pourchaire and Esteban Ocon, and that was partly because they used the all-powerful Honda engine. My team was 3rd in the end, still using Honda power, whilst it was McLaren Ferrari who took the Constructors' title with a 20-point margin over Red Bull. For comparison, last year McLaren had Renault engines and had their worst season in the career to date. Anyway, in the spec engine formula of F2, the series had their first ever repeat champion because Kimi Antonelli was still allowed to race there in this game, and this time both Trident drivers broke the 400 point barrier. Unsurprisingly, Trident won the team's championship with more points than the 2nd, 3rd, 4th and 5th place teams combined. In F3, Christian Mansell came out on top in the drivers' standings, and this time it was Rodin who were the team's champion. Last season, since I had no affiliate drivers, the game bugged out and asked me to invest in Behrman's development, which I did, and who knows if it worked, but it'd be fair to say he needed all the help he could get. Now that he has the already 86 rated Kimi Antonelli as his teammate for 2027. Behrman's overall was 5 lower, but further car development along with Antonelli being very much an F1 quality driver along with Behrman being okay, and both still had huge growth potential, meant my team's time in Formula 1's limelight had arrived. Even Charles Leclerc, McLaren and Lewis Hamilton at Red Bull weren't a match for us. And certainly neither were either of the comedy signings, the first 2 of many we'll see in this playthrough, as RB replaced Hulkenberg with the former McLaren F1 driver and Formula E champion, but only 68 rated Stoffel Vandoorne, or Alpine's merely 63 rated replacement for George Russell, Formula 3 driver Joseph Loke. He finished 26th in the Drivers' Championship in real life, and in the game so far he's come 18th in 2024, then pointless in 28th in 2025, and most recently 23rd in 2026. If you're wondering why Alpine signed him, so am I. And it's not as if he was good, not by a long chalk. Arguably though, Vandoorne was worse. He was certainly more haphazard. And I like Vandoorne, and I think he was a victim of circumstance and dropped from F1 too soon in real life. But you can't bring him back all these years later. Well, you can, but that's a roll of the dice you don't need to do when Perez, Tsunoda, Ricciardo, and even reigning champion Piastri are all sat on the sidelines. My team were almost untouchable. On raw outright speed we could potentially be rivaled, but over the course of a race distance we couldn't be topped, because our tyre life was vastly superior to everyone else's. Also, just like in the previous F1 Manager games, the performance spread between the teams, generally speaking, over the years narrows up, making it a much more competitive and closely matched field than we see in real life, which explains how we get massive trains like this well after the start of a Grand Prix. Obviously though, my team is the outlier to that, even though we had entirely 1 and 2 star car development facilities, and by no means the strongest technical personnel, because in this game none of that really matters. But we did have Kimi Antonelli, Despite this being his debut year in F1 and he wasn't yet the highest rated driver in the sport, but he may as well have been, as he won 19 of the 24 Grand Prix and dominated everyone else in the Drivers' Championship. He broke the real-life record for the most amount of points in an F1 season with a total of 603, 133 more than his teammate and runner-up Ollie Bearman, who won 4 Grand Prix this year. And Verstappen finished 3rd in the championship and was the only non-PSL racing driver to take the checker flag as he won in a simulated Miami Grand Prix. The now Ferrari driver Pourchaire outscored the Red Bull of Lewis Hamilton in the fight for 4th. Sainz yet again had an amazing year with Sauber, and thanks to him having a Ferrari engine again, he scored 97 points, and even bested his former teammate Leclerc in a McLaren. Gasly in the other Sauber also had a more successful season with a more powerful engine, as he scored 28 points, only 4 less than the Mercedes of Bottas. And 4 drivers didn't score a point, including Joe in a Renault-engined Haas, the 2 Renault-powered Aston Martins, and Joseph Loeb. In the Constructors, PSL Racing smashed the quadruple points barrier with a record of 1,073 points, more than Ferrari and Red Bull combined. Sauber continued their upwards trajectory with 5th place, beating the Works Mercedes team, and only Aston Martin ended 2027 on 0. In the feeder series, with Antonelli out of the way, it was his old teammate Zane Maloney who won in F2 and led a Trident 1-2 to see them win the team's championship. Whilst in F3 we're already seeing our first fictional driver win there, as Red Bull affiliate Siegfried Jung was crowned the champion, but Tommy Smith was tied on points with him, and it was Smith's team Van Amersfoort Racing who won the team's championship. Despite not even winning the Formula 3 title, Tommy Smith has found his way onto the F1 grid for 2028 at Alpine, with Van Dorn in the other seat. That makes this by far and away the lowest rated F1 driver pairing, with both drivers sub 70 rated. I mean, it's Formula 3 caliber at most, and it's a significant step down from Sargent, who's reunited with Albon as Bottas' replacement at Mercedes. Also worth pointing out, Piastri's back in F1 after a 1-year absence and is racing for RB. Unsurprisingly, my team dominated again, and we only came unstuck once, and that was at Monaco, and only because Antonelli crashed into a slow-moving Van Dorn, and then Bearman also threw away the race lead by hitting the wall head-on at Saint-Devote. So we missed out on claiming a 100% win record, but that's our only black mark. Antonelli became a double world champion and broke his own record for points in the season by 5, with an insurmountable total of 608. Théo Pourchaire was the best of the rest, albeit with less than half the points Antonelli accrued, with Alex Albon 4th and Logan Sargent 5th, meaning the 2 Mercedes are ahead of both Red Bulls of Verstappen and Hamilton. Apart from Antonelli, Oscar Piastri was the star of the season as he finished 7th in the championship, ahead of Hamilton and the Red Bull, and with only a Renault-powered RB to work with. That even eclipses Sainz's earlier performances at Sauber, particularly when Piastri's RB teammate Iwasa scored 100 points less. Fair play to Tommy Smith for being chucked in the F1 deep end with a crap car and still scoring a point, unlike Van Dorn or even Stroll in a Haas. At PSL Racing we scored 1 point more than we did in 2027, setting the record points tally even higher, with Mercedes the runner-up. RB did incredibly well to finish 6th entirely thanks to Piastri, and this year every team got on the score sheet. My affiliate driver Paul Aron cruised to victory in F2 with 2024 F3 champion Tim Tramnitz as his nearest challenger, but still with only just over half the points Aron had. Trident won the team's championship for the 4th year in a row. Meanwhile in F3, the originally Alpine affiliated F1 Academy driver turned McLaren and now PSL Racing affiliated Formula 3 driver Abby Pulling made history to become the first female FIA Formula 3 champion. And it was almost a PSL Racing 1-2 there, as regen Ronald Nichols finished 3rd, but he was still the best non-Trident driver, and in fact, Trident are the first outfit in this game save to win the F3 Teams Championship twice. It's business as usual for 2029, except Sergio Perez has returned to F1 after a 4-year-long absence, and you can tell he's been out for a while as he's only 71 rated, 10 less than his teammate Lawson, and 15 less than when he was last on the grid back in 2024. Begs the question why he's been brought back, but it could be worse, as Alpine have hit an even lower low. Van Dorn has been replaced by Antonio Giovinazzi, another blast from the past, and Tommy Smith is out in favour of Pietro Fittipaldi. That's 67 and 59 rated respectively. 59 for Fittipaldi makes him the lowest rated F1 driver we've seen. My 6th season managing my own created team was when I finally achieved a 100% Grand Prix win record. That's never been done in F1 history, but 19 wins for Antonelli and 5 for Behrman gave us a championship first. It's also the 3rd year in a row Antonelli was crowned the Formula 1 Drivers' Champion, and he once again scored more than 600 points, with Behrman in 2nd breaking the 500 point barrier for the first time. The only race we didn't win was a simulated Austria Sprint, which actually saw an Aston Martin 1-2 headed up by the formerly Alpine teammates of Gasly and sprint race winner Ocon. Those two in that order were our closest rivals this season, whilst McLaren had a resurgence with Norris 5th and Leclerc 7th. Red Bull had a shocking season with Verstappen down in 10th and with 13 fewer points than Sargent. Despite the lower rating and having been away from F1 for 4 years, Perez was still the lead Williams driver with triple the points of Lawson. Whereas it's no surprise the two firmly non-F1 quality drivers in that mess of an Alpine team didn't score any points, along with Jack doing for Sauber. PSL Racing shattered the 1,100 point ceiling, and fair play to Lawrence Stroll, and let's assume Adrian Newey, because it can only be Newey magic that explains Aston being the obviously best team apart from mine, and the only team that could even occasionally be a concern for my team. At the other end of the table, we can see the Renault engine is as strong as ever, with the bottom 3 teams of Sauber, Williams and pointless Alpine all using it. The PSL Racing dominance stretched to the feeder categories too, as Paul Aron won again and scored 112 points more than last season, meaning his contribution alone secured Trident their team's championship. Abby Pulling is the Formula 3 champion for the 2nd time in a row and with a larger winning margin than before, but her teammates let the side down badly as Trident didn't win the team's championship. Instead it was MP Motorsport. I'm sure you've got the gist, especially when we're now truly top tier driver pairing of Behrman and Antonelli. And Antonelli now is 3 overall higher than Max Verstappen ever was. For variety's sake and to stop my own team's dominance, I left them heading into the new decade. I decided to join the shambles that is Alpine, and they were in such disarray that they hadn't even signed any drivers yet, which is actually a good thing since that's been their biggest weakness. Carlos Sainz was a free agent astonishingly, and I tried to sign him but I wasn't able to as he was being funny with his requirements, and ultimately ran out of patience. That's how uninterested he is about being in F1, and this is also the last we see of him in this playthrough. So instead I signed the best free agents I could actually do a deal with, which turned out to be George Russell, who was also on the scrap heap of drivers for some insane reason, and Nicolas Solov, who's a Formula 3 driver in real life but notably came 3rd in the 2029 Formula 2 Championship, and has a solid 78 rating. Better than, for example, Van Dorn, who's back in F1 again and this time with Haas. But whilst I stabilised Alpine, Williams decided to go mad as they too hadn't signed a driver heading into the new year, so I guess James Vowles panicked. And this one hell of a panic to not get signed, especially since he's with them in real life, and instead pick up Giovinazzi and debutant Keen Nakamura Berta. In fact, this pairing right here is the worst we ever come across, and if you hadn't guessed it by now, the driver market doesn't really work on logic. There's not much to say about Alpine since I turned a joke team with no money, a Tiger Print car that was 2 seconds a lap off, into a race winner within 2.5 seasons and a championship winner after 4. Alpine were in nowhere near as dire of a position, even though they were over $6 million in debt when I took them over. What's more worth talking about is my old team, who were in phenomenal record-breaking shape when I left them. Immediately, they threw that away as Terry Pourchaire won in Bahrain, with Verstappen 2nd, whilst Antonelli, the best driver on the grid in what was a dominant team when I was there 3 months ago, was 15 seconds down in 3rd place, and Behrman a further 15 seconds behind in 6th. That's not even the worst of it, as in the Miami Sprint both Alpines were quicker than Behrman and finished ahead of him, even though all 3 of us were outside of the points places. That's how extreme the drop off from my old team was, and to put that in even more context, both of my drivers were beaten by Giovinazzi and the Williams. So Alpine weren't amazing, PSL Racing just collapsed. In my absence, they did swap from Honda to Renault engines, but that doesn't explain the capitulation. The Renault engine simply isn't anywhere near bad enough to explain this mess. They did improve late in the season with them locking out the bottom 2 places of the podium in Austin. So maybe they did no development at the start of the year and then a disproportionate amount at the end. That seems ridiculous, and even if that's the case, I'm still surprised they fell off so sharply so soon after I left. And it's not as if they started off with a load of extra weight. I mean, they had about 17 kilos excess, but that's less than Ferrari and Red Bull. So they struggled even with a weight advantage. But with PSL racing out of the championship picture, it allowed some other teams and drivers to shine. In any season where Stroll is at Ferrari and Sargent is at Mercedes and both finish on the podium in the same race is a season that's absolutely worth talking about. Ferrari were the strongest outfit this season, but specifically Théo Pourchaire, who was the Drivers' Champion in 2030. 581 points is a ridiculous tally, and he beat his teammate Lance Stroll, who's the runner-up, by 223 points. Antonelli came third, and then both Red Bulls led by Hadjars were now past Verstappen's peak. Ocon, Albon, Gasly and the 2 McLarens of Norris and Leclerc all split the 2 PSL racing drivers as Behrman finished down in 11th. Not even on a triple figure points count. That's appalling. Solov in 14th was the lead Alpine driver, but Russell still scored 11 points, although he was the lowest placed driver to score points. Ferrari were by far the quickest team at the start of the new decade and won the Constructors' Championship, with Red Bull also outscoring PSL Racing. In just 1 year, I moved Alpine up from pointless and last up to 8th in the standings ahead of Haas, Sauber and the new joke team of Williams. Formula 2 had its first regen Drivers' Champion with Ferrari affiliate Vincenzo Sanna, narrowly emerging on top. So this was a brilliant year for Ferrari and PHM AIX Racing, who were the team's champions in F2 for the first time. In Formula 3, Abby Pulling won again. And I think now is when I should really talk about the driver ratings, and let's focus on Pulling to begin with because she's a very interesting case study. Of course, in real life, a 2024 F1 Academy champion, and now in this game a back-to-back-to-back Formula 3 champion. And let's forget that should be impossible. When Pulling won her first F3 title in 2028, she was 66 rated, actually 67 at the start of the year. With that in mind, her coming out on top wasn't totally bizarre, as she was one of the highest rated drivers. In 2029, she went from 65 to 64 overall and still won, which was against the odds. But for her to maintain that winning streak at just 61 overall by the end of 2030 is ridiculous. By then, she wasn't even the highest rated PSL Racing affiliate in Formula 3, as Ronald Nichols was 66 overall. I gave all of my affiliates a lot of FP1 outings, and maybe that provided my drivers, Ronald Nichols included, given he's also outdone himself, just not to the same extent as Pulling. Maybe those FP1 appearances gave my drivers a hidden boost that meant they performed better in the feeder championships. It's the only consistent possible explanation I can come up with. Also, you might be wondering why Abby Pulling's rating was dropping when she was doing brilliantly in F3. Well, by this point she was 25 years old, and in this game that's when age-related attribute degradation starts to kick in. And trust me, speaking as a 26-year-old guy, I don't know whether to be depressed or offended by that. But in all seriousness, that's a bold design choice. To put that in context, if you take the starting 2024 F1 grid at the age they are right now, that means all the drivers apart from Tsunoda, Sargent and Piastri are over the hill and will only get worse. It also explains why we see drivers retire in their 20s in this game. 23 years old is the youngest I saw, and that happened more than once. But to be fair, generally those are drivers who weren't competing in F1, F2 or F3 and had no real potential. Drivers can still improve their ratings to halt or even reverse any age-related rating drops, but this seems to be something only the better drivers can do. Norris, for example, grew from 89 to 90 overall, and Russell had one season at 88 instead of 87. Verstappen didn't lose overall for the first 4 years, but then dropped by 4 in the next 2. Alonso only fell by 1 overall in 3 years, before disappearing off the grid. And Hamilton did 5 years in F1 and only dropped by 3, even though he'd have been firmly into his 40s by then. So that complicates and confuses trying to interpret the rating system, but I don't mind that because, in broad terms at least, it does work and makes sense. Antonelli's growth in overall was meteoric and far surpassed Behrman's. Another young and exciting prospect, but isn't quite being touted as the next generational talent in the same way that Antonelli is. Certainly this game is a great improvement on the previous F1 Manager games, which had very stilted and predictable attribute growth, with almost everyone going up by 1 overall per year every year. Similarly, the rate and growth of non-driver staff members is also now more fluid and does yield some interesting outcomes. Does it matter? Not really, since I developed a championship winning car with very low rated staff members. It's not like driver ratings, they're actually meaningful. This? Nah. Regardless, James Key, for example, started off as one of the lowest rated technical chiefs, but thanks to often jumping up by 2 overall per year when most increased by 1 or even 0 per year, he eventually became the best outright technical chief and hit a 99 overall rating by 2036. Weirdly, it was mainly staff members who spent a lot of time working at either Williams or RB that experienced these huge rating growths. And that could be because they potentially invested more into personnel development facilities than the other teams, or it could just be a big coincidence. Well, James Key spent 7 years at Williams and became the best technical chief. Jody Egginton started at RB, was there for 6 years straight, grew by 11 overall in that time and even jumped up by 3 in a year from 2025 to 2026, which is almost unprecedented. And he became the second best technical chief. Guru Joel started at RB, moved to Sauber, then had a prolonged stint at Williams, then back to Sauber and back to RB and became the joint best head of aero, along with Enrico Balbo, who had an 11 overall head start on him. Or, best of all, in 2036 the highest rated race engineer wasn't someone like Bono, and Lambiase disappeared before the end, so presumably retired. Instead, the 2 best race engineers are 98 rated Pierre Hamlin, who starts off as Daniel Ricciardo's race engineer, and a 100 overall, and the only person to reach 100 overall in the whole game by 2036, Mattia Spini, who starts off as Yuki Tsunoda's race engineer. Both originally RB race engineers. Also, since I've mentioned Tsunoda, he's a brilliant but extreme example of one final change made to the rating system that I want to talk about. Tsunoda only raced in the first 2 seasons of this career mode and initially went up from 83 to 84 overall. But he never gets back into F1, and over time this has a devastating impact on his rating. At the start of the new decade, he was only 70 overall, which will either make him a talented F3 driver or a forgettable F2 driver. Even at the end of my career playthrough, the start of 2036, Tsunoda was still available to hire, but you just wouldn't, as he's one of the worst drivers in the whole game and a mere 54 overall. Below that are other recognisable F1 rejects like Kei Nakamura Berta, Joseph Loke, and Tommy Smith, with former Alpine driver Smith the 3rd lowest rated driver in the whole game at 40 overall. That's abysmal. It also explains why Perez, when he came back after a 4-year absence, was 15 overall lower than he was before and nowhere near as good as anyone else who was on the grid that year, apart from Alpine's 2 comedy signings. Even Piastri, who sat out the 2027 season, left at 92 overall and higher than his teammate Norris, but came back a year later at 87 overall, whereas Norris was still at 90. In fact, it takes until 2032 for Piastri to undo the relative damage there, and that's partly because Norris wasn't racing in 2031. Although, to be fair, neither was Piastri. It's a weird year because they're not around, but Enzo Fittipaldi is back and took Piastri's old RB seat. But again, Fittipaldi hasn't been seen in F1 since he raced for my team 5 seasons ago, and in that time his overall has dropped by 11. Yet apparently RB couldn't find anyone more qualified. Also frauding their way in, have you got the impression I stopped taking this driver market seriously? Is Martinius Stenshorn. He had progressed up from Formula 3 and had some success there as he finished 3rd in 2027. But in 2030 he was the lowest point scorer in Formula 2, yet was now in a Williams Formula 1 race seat. Barika Similani, who did better, finishing 14th in F2, became the first female F1 race driver since Lella Lombardi in 1976, as she joined PSL Racing alongside Ollie Behrman. And that's because Antonelli has finally landed a Mercedes race seat and shares a team with the mighty Logan Sargent. This was a season where you couldn't possibly predict what would happen from one race to the next. Perhaps not surprisingly, it was Pourchaire and Antonelli at Ferrari and Mercedes respectively who started the year strongly, and it looked to be a year with a title fight between those two drivers and teams. At Alpine we had a mixed start. 4th for Solov in Bahrain was encouraging, but 9th for Russell, a drop of 5 places from where we qualified, was disappointing. But it was still a huge step up from where we were the previous year, and that was without a load of upgrades as I had the money to design them but not to manufacture them. So some weren't fitted to the car until the Australian Grand Prix and the rest until the Japanese Grand Prix, and they made a big impact, with Russell winning in Japan and only the otherworldly talents of Antonelli preventing an Alpine 1-2. It wasn't just the aerodynamic benefits we got from those new parts that helped us. It was the weight saving that also helped, and every year I've won, I've done it by having the lightest car on the grid. Something that the other teams don't seem to think is important at all. In fact, the weight of their cars fluctuates up and down, as Antonelli had 10.6 kilos of excess weight in Saudi, but then 17.2 kilos for Japan. And with us at 0 kgs excess, it suddenly explains how we went from behind to ahead of him so quickly. So given that teams would have developed new parts as and when they could, which may or may not have been lighter than their older parts, you can understand where every team's form wavered a lot, as McLaren were a race-winning team for a while, quicker than even my lightweight Alpine team. But best of all was Stenshorn finishing 5th in Britain. To cut a long story short, and there's a lot you could talk about in this season alone, the upshot is that this was a hard-fought season, and of course I had to deal with a lackluster Renault engine by being the works Renault team. But it was George Russell who was crowned the 2031 Drivers' Champion. Just 5 race wins, but this was a season where almost everyone had a moment in the spotlight, and Russell was the most consistently front-running driver in the pack, with Pourchaire for Ferrari the runner-up and 28 points back. Antonelli was a further 30 points away and only 6 ahead of Albon in a McLaren at the end, with Solov in the second Alpine 5th in the table, but still within 3 race wins worth of points of Russell. Hadjar was the lead Red Bull driver again, and Stroll also outscored Verstappen again despite having a much worse season than the previous one. Sargent in the second Mercedes was down in 11th with 256 points less than his teammate Antonelli, with Stenshorn scoring an incredible 23 points, more than Behrman in a PSL racing car, but behind Similana, who, fair play to her, was the lead PSL racing driver in what was an appalling year for my old team. Both Aston Martins of Ocon and Gasly didn't score a point, which tells you just how awful their car was. Alpine were the Constructors' Champions, making them the first Renault-powered title victors in this career. But we were only 69 points ahead of McLaren. It says a lot about this game that in just 2 years, I turned Alpine from a slow, dead-riddled team to champions on hard difficulty. And I will keep stressing that point, because if this is hard, then I don't want to know what easy looks like. Whilst PSL Racing fell from dominant outfit to 7th within 2 seasons. I know teams have natural fluctuations, Aston Martin being a great example as they were the only team to end on 0. But this game is nuts. In Formula 2, the Red Bull affiliate of Stefan Ernst was the Drivers' Champion, and his team Invicta were the Team's Champion. In Formula 3, Jean Oliver has taken over Abby Pulling's mantle and carried on the run of female champions. Although Pulling still took 3rd in the table, which is unbelievable for a driver who, on paper, is one of the worst in the championship. Trident were the team's champion, but only 10 points clear of ART. Having turned Alpine into champions and with my created team in freefall, I went back to them. They hadn't bothered to sign any drivers, which gave me a good opportunity to reset the team, and I still couldn't promote any affiliates, which would have been handy as Zane Maloney was a solid driver still on our books, and we're still paying $2 million a year for him to do nothing at all. But he'd already long since announced his retirement and was just waiting for his contract to run out. So since I couldn't promote him into a race seat, and terminating him would have achieved nothing and cost $40 million to do so, as my money-making scheme to try and use his talents to extract a huge paycheck from the other teams hadn't come to fruition, as even they aren't stupid or desperate enough to fall for that. So I instead signed the 2 best free agents, Charles Leclerc and Lando Norris. Even in 2032, that's a solid driver pairing, with both of them in the low 80s for overall, now they're in their early 30s in age. Ollie Behrman left PSL Racing after an 8-year stint to drive for RB, replacing Enzo Fittipaldi, who, even despite his far from great 2031 season, is still on the F1 grid but now with Sauber. Piastri's back in F1 and back at McLaren, and has have the, on paper, joke lineup this year, but despite their low ratings, Simulander did well at PSL Racing and Stenshorn fantastically at Williams. So this is a much more logical pairing than the numbers suggest. Also, this is the year we see Antonelli reach his peak of 97 overall, a figure no other driver even gets close to. Yet again, a team I just won a championship with fumbled that golden position, in part this time due to them adding over 3 kilos of extra weight before even starting the season. But the game bugged out anyway, and this was the season where in Bahrain, defending champion George Russell crossed the finish line in 9th, but was deemed the race winner with a total race time of 1 second. In reality, it was Lando Norris in the Marlboro coloured PSL racing car who won on his debut with the team, and on my first race after returning to my own team. After the British Grand Prix, halfway through the season, my drivers were 1st and 2nd in the championship, but we still haven't seen the best of Antonelli or Mercedes yet. Fast forward to Austin, and in the sprint we had to contend with both Mercs, even Sargent, who temporarily led, having taken 1st place away from Norris. I simulated the Grand Prix and Antonelli won it, with Norris 2nd and then Sargent in 3rd, and ahead of Leclerc. At this point, Antonelli was only 23 points behind Norris, and Leclerc slipped to 4th and behind Pourchaire. In Mexico, we were actually helped by a Fittipaldi crash, which makes a change for me, as that halted a late race fresh tyre charge by Antonelli. But even then, the best we could hope for was 3rd for Norris, with Antonelli 4th and 5th for Leclerc. But to show how undominant we were this year, Sargent and the other Mercedes was leading the race at one point, and there was a fight between him and Pourchaire, albeit one Sargent lost. Then another botched tyre strategy called by Antonelli in Brazil, where he didn't pit when the safety car came out whereas everyone else did, and that tyre wear disadvantage did the Italian no favours as he slipped from 1st place all the way down to 6th. The point I'm making is that Antonelli had every possibility to win a Drivers' Championship as a Mercedes driver but bottled it. Even the win in Vegas with Norris down in 7th, a sprint victory in Qatar and a last lap pass on Pourchaire for the Grand Prix victory still put him behind Norris in the Drivers' Championship, even if only by 9 points. Remarkably, it looked like a late race pit stop for Antonelli in Abu Dhabi onto fresh mediums that allowed him to surge up the order and be involved in an on-track battle with Solov for the Grand Prix win was going to decide the Drivers' Championship, as Antonelli needed to win with Norris stuck down in 4th. 2nd wouldn't have been enough. But then a crash between Behrman and Lawson brought out the red flag, giving us a 2-lap showdown and with everyone on minimally worn soft tyres. With the field bunched back up and equalised, Antonelli held on to the lead for the first lap, but then DRS for Solov meant he got back in front, and then the Mercedes driver lost a drag race with Stroll. 3rd place for Antonelli, despite what the game said in race, and I have no idea exactly what the glitch is here, but it's one of the hundreds I encountered. Lando Norris won the 2032 Drivers' Championship, and I took my team back to the top the very year I returned. Antonelli could so easily have beaten Norris. I mean, Norris was the champion despite only winning 6 of the 24 Grand Prix this year. In a season where everyone was inconsistent, Norris was the most regularly at the top because Antonelli threw it away. Pourchaire took 3rd in the standings, and Leclerc, the higher rated of my 2 drivers, had a weirdly poor season as he was 4th overall, 98 points down on Norris. Alpine could only manage 6th for Solov and 8th for defending champion Russell with me not around. Sargent finished 9th with 100 points, and in the bottom half of the table there's a lot of interesting results, but most notable is that Ocon in the lead Aston Martin scored 62 points, whereas teammate Gasly scored just 1. The same as Lawson in the Sauber, with Enzo Fittipaldi, what a wild time in F1 he's had, the only driver to finish on 0. In the Constructors, PSL Racing won comfortably, which isn't a surprise as we have 2 decent drivers unlike Mercedes and Ferrari. Alpine in 4th with presumably Briatore back running things. McLaren with a Renault engine did terribly to finish 10th, albeit still with 41 points as it was quite competitive across the grid this year. That is if you exclude Sauber with their solitary point. For the following season I started my new era of PSL Racing dominance with 2 new young and promising drivers. And coincidentally the drivers that placed 1st and 2nd in Formula 2 this season, Vincenzo Sanna and Katsumi Yamazaki. Their success was hardly surprising, especially as Sanna had already won the F2 title in 2030 and ends 2032 84 rated, which is way too good to still be in F2. Despite Yamazaki's best efforts at Trident and Sanna's at PHM AIX Racing, it was Rodin who were the team's champions, but it was a mega close fight with just 5 points separating those top 3 teams. In F3, Kurt Arnold was the new champion, with Abby Pulling finally succumbing to her age, even though she's only 29 years old, and slipped to just 10th in the points standings. Hi-Tech were the team's champions. Sanna and Yamazaki firmed up our place as the team to beat in F1 again, and even at 22 and 23 years old, and as F1 debutantes, they're already amongst the highest rated drivers in the championship. Just behind Verstappen, but that doesn't matter anyway since the Dutchman is on the reject pile and no one ever picks him up again, so that's the end of his F1 career. Yamazaki wasn't the only new woman on the grid as Tempest McKinnon. Despite only being 74 rated, partners Antonelli at Mercedes. Defending champion Norris joins another regen driver Donald Conway at Alpine. Nikola Solov has impressed ever since I emergency signed him for Alpine and has fully earned his new role at Red Bull. I switched to Mercedes engines just to try him out since I've won time and time again with Honda power units, and just in case we're in another title fight with Antonelli, I want engine parity with him just to make it a truer comparison. There wasn't a fight though. The game may have said we had a bad car, but that so blatantly wasn't true, and if anything it just meant we were effortlessly raking in money from sponsors who were relentlessly surprised that we kept on winning. Even us breaching the cost cap, which is nowhere near as big of an issue as it is in real life, wasn't a dampener on a return to dominance for PSL Racing. Vincenzo Sanna became the first regen driver to win the F1 Drivers' Championship, beating his new teammate by 58 points. Pourchaire was the best of the rest with Antonelli 4th, but what's incredible is that, even despite switching from Mercedes to Haas, Sargent finished 9th in the Drivers' Championship for the 2nd year in a row, and outscored Piastri as well as both Alpines as the French outfit has now totally chucked away the brilliant position I dragged them into. Tempest McKinnon scored just 4 points in the Mercedes, which is utterly dreadful. But better than Lawson in the McLaren, who somehow didn't score a point, that Red Bull's second driver curse clearly somehow still carrying on. And that's shocking, bearing in mind the only other person who didn't score a point was Stenshorn in the Sauber. Sauber finished last overall but still got a double-figure points count. The first time ever in his career made a team go into double digits but still ended last. Haas, thanks to the endless talents of Sargent, finished 6th in the Constructors' Championship and were only narrowly beaten by a much improved Aston Martin. But importantly, we won the Constructors' Championship again, and for the first time ever, and thanks to Jonathan Wheatley, who my team hired when I wasn't there, which seems to be the only smart thing they did, PSL Racing won the Pit Stop Championship. That netted us $12 million, which seems to be a bit of an exploit because that's more than we are paying Wheatley. In the junior categories, Ricardo Palumbo's the hot new talent in F2 as he won the driver's title comfortably, and Hi-Tech the team's championship. In Formula 3 was Gregory Cyrilak. Apologies if I've mispronounced that name, but it's not as if he or pretty much anyone in Formula 3 is recognisable by now. And ART the team's champion. For 2034, the only 2 details you need to know is that I switched to Renault engines just to see if I can still get by with the low-powered power units holding me back. And Kimi Antonelli left Mercedes for Ferrari, meaning Ferrari have the 2 best drivers around and at the absolute peak of their powers. Finally, the game had thrown up some proper competition. I mean, I still won both championships, and maybe that's partly because Ferrari still decided to run with over 20 kilograms of excess weight, even at the tail end of a season during a white-hot championship battle with me. Some of the other teams were running with over 30 kilograms. They added on 10 kilograms from the start of the year. Anyway, Sanna became a double world champion with the same number of race wins and only 2 fewer points than the year before. It's probably fair to say we weren't much worse this year, it's just we finally had some worthy, even if pointlessly overweight, competition as Kimi Antonelli was the runner-up and only 26 points away. Pourchaire outscored Yamazaki by 2 points, but Yamazaki didn't do much worse in 2033 as she was only 29 points worse off. Nikola Solov, fair play to the guy who was brought into F1 by my desperation. He was the best of the rest and the lead Red Bull driver as he bested actual Red Bull Junior Hadjar. Stefan Ernst, the 2031 F2 champion, came 7th for Mercedes, whilst a rejuvenated Sauber after their switch from Renault engines last year to Honda ones this year, Did great with Russell in 10th and Stenshorn, the one wildcard who's proven himself time and time again, 13th with 42 points. Barika Similani and Hella Marchand of Haas and Aston Martin respectively were the two drivers stuck on nil. Only 31 points less for us, but crucially a jump of 270 points for Ferrari meant it was a closely run Constructors' title fight. Honestly, if Ferrari weren't stupid with car weight, they would have beaten us to both titles and probably easily so. Again, this is hard difficulty and I seem to be the only person operating according to basic motorsport principles. At the other end of the table, Renault-powered Aston Martin ended the year in last. However, I didn't retain the pit stop championship, and when you have instances where 5 drivers all have the exact same pit stop time but the game awards Ferrari 43 points and me 22, it's not really a surprise I only came 3rd. 82 rated Red Bull affiliate Carmela Fontana made history to become the first woman to win the F2 Drivers' title, beating both Trident drivers in presumably better cars as Trident won the team's championship. In F3, Nicholas Diamond, another Red Bull affiliate, was the drivers' champion and ART were the team's champion. 2035. The final full season I did and one where I went with Ferrari engines just to complete the set. I also wanted to run with no sponsors just to tick that off, but you have to have a title sponsor. So instead I just sacked off all the secondary sponsors and took the financial hit to see if that would force me into a position that would hold the team back. It didn't. With Ferrari power, we were backfiring in all cylinders almost literally as we returned to our all-conquering ways, with Senna becoming a triple world champion and with a full 556 points, with Yamazaki nearly 100 away but still ahead of the 2 Ferraris led by Antonelli. Next is the 2 Red Bulls and McLarens with Solov and Fontana the lead drivers of their respective teams, which is great for Fontana, but more to the point, it's a shame for Solov that the only time his teammates were Russell and lost out to him was the year they had a championship winning car. And I don't know what happened to Solov that year either. Logan Sargent took a top 10 slot with a Sauber, whilst Tempest McKinnon was the lead Mercedes driver as her new teammate Norris was all the way down in 17th, with just 6 points. Every driver scored this year, which proves my point that slowly and steadily the pace gap between the teams, excluding my own, has shrunk. I mean, Joe and Stenshorn both scored a point yet finished outside the top 20. PSL Racing were back in the quadruple points range with 1,019 points, 271 ahead of Ferrari even though we were using their own engine. And we had a lower rated driver pairing. Mercedes had a shocker down in 8th, and RB came last with 8 points. And guess which engine they were using? This time it was Ferrari affiliates dominating the junior categories of 84 overall Angela Medina, the 2035 F2 champion, and her team High-Tech, the team's champion. Runeback was the Formula 3 drivers champion and MP Motorsport the team's champion. And that's it. This mega career mode with a hell of a lot of oddities has finally reached, not technically the end since the career mode in this game goes on indefinitely, but as far as I'm willing to go, and it took me over 130 hours just to get here. But even this far down the line, we've still got teams making baffling hiring decisions as Williams employed a 60 overall driver. And Mercedes a second worst driver we ever see in F1 at 57 overall. But look how many fictional drivers there are now. It shows how far into the future we are, but also how far from reality we are. Although if we're talking about reality, then realism went out the window a long time ago. If you've watched this video all the way to the end, then I cannot thank you enough. Especially with how long it is and how long it took me to put together, apologies for that. And whilst this might be the end of the road for F1 Manager 2024 and this whole series of games, I have got a couple of videos planned that will be a return to the F1 management games of old. Hopefully you guys are excited for that. Please do check them out when they go up, as this here isn't the end of the F1 Manager videos from me. At least not quite yet. So I'll see you guys then.